Okay, everybody, I guess we'll get started. We do know a few more people are coming, but since it's almost 4:10, we'll just get started. So before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to make a couple announcements about upcoming talks. So the first one is by Professor Giulio Tihanchi, right? Correct. He's professor of political science and international studies at De La Salle University in Manila. And he'll be speaking on next week, April 8th at 4 o'clock, different room though. And he'll be talking about the 2019 Philippine midterm elections. So please join us then. Also following that, also in April 15th, the following one, is a roundtable and workshop roundtable discussion with our very own Stefan Ortman. He'll be on the panel, and it's called Authoritarian Governance and Singapore's Developmental State, the roundtable. So it brings together three academics, Donald Lowe, Cherian George, and our own Stephen Ortman, to discuss Singapore's recent political developments and its relevance as a governance model for other countries. So please join us if you can. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Claudine Ang. Dr. Ong, excuse me. Claudine. We started our PhDs together way back at Cornell in 2005, I think it was. And our first course together was Intro to Pre-Modern Southeast Asia at 10:10 a.m. with Eric Taliacoso. So that was the first, that's how far back we go.
I think that's right.
Yeah, 10:10. And so we've been in touch ever since. And now Claudine is assistant professor of humanities, focusing on history at Yale and US College in Singapore. She completed her doctoral studies at Cornell University, where her dissertation was awarded the 2012 Lauriston Sharp Prize for Best Dissertation, one that I also applied for but didn't get. So it is a very prestigious and competitive prize. But her book from that manuscript, called Poetic Transformations, 18th Century Cultural Projects on the Mekong Plains, is forthcoming this July 2019 with Harvard University Asia Center Publications. So congratulations, that's very great. And her second book project examines the woodblock print production of Vietnamese language books composed in the Demotic script in 19th century Guangdong and its distribution in Saigon. So that's pretty amazing as well. So today's talk will be on the nature of Ming Loyalism, a century after the fall of the Ming. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Claudine Ang.
Should I just speak? Will this capture? Oh, test. It's all good?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me here to enjoy Hong Kong and to meet all of you at this forum. So as Tom was saying, my talk is entitled The Nature of Ming Loyalism, a Century After the Fall of the Ming. I think after I talk a little bit more about the landscape poetry, you know why I use the word nature. But anyway, that was just for a little bit of fun. So today I will be discussing the poetry of someone called Mak Tian Tu. In Mandarin Chinese is Mo Tian Ci. Although he was from Guangdong, so he would probably be speaking Cantonese, but I'm afraid I don't speak Cantonese, so I don't know what it's called in Cantonese, his name. But this is a person, because this is in the 18th century, this is a second generation migrant to the Mekong Delta. So Mak Tian Tu was the son of a Chinese Ming loyalist. During the transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty, his father fled from Guangdong and to the western regions of the Mekong Delta. Okay. So basically, let me just get used to this. So basically, the Mak family is from actually the Leizhou Peninsula, somewhere here, and after the fall of the Ming, they were already a seafaring family, and they came and they settled here in this region. Hatian, it's not very clear, but it's because of the transition from the MAC to the PC. But anyway, this is Hatian on the border today between Cambodia and Vietnam. Okay, so it's the western part of the Mekong Delta. And today, Hatian is actually a fairly sleeping fishing town because the delta, that's the Mekong Delta, it has silted up, as deltas tend to do, and it's no longer as good a port as it used to be in the past. In the 18th century, however, it was a very busy port that was predominantly ethnic Chinese. But you also had Khmer people living there because the area used to belong to the Cambodians. And the chronicles also note that people from Japan, Philippines, Java were also going there. So the Chinese population that came to be settled in Ha Tien arrived largely in 1671 as part of a wave of migration of people fleeing China. The Chinese population of Ha Tien, of course, professed loyalty to the Ming dynasty. And they wrote, we wanted to leave because so that we didn't have to cut our hair. So it's a very overt identification of the Ming. To shave our head, sorry. And the leader of this group is Mo Jiu or Mak Piu. And so he was the one who really made Ha Tien a prosperous settlement that boasted a busy port that was linked to the South China Sea trade. So the junks would come from Fujian, Guangdong, hug the coast up, and then round the delta to Ha Tien and then to the Gulf of Siam, and then back the other way again, depending on the monsoons. So having moved away from China because of political turmoil, Mak Kiu soon found himself embroiled in Siamese, Vietnamese, and Cambodian politics on the delta, the Mekong Delta. And in 1708, he found that he had to switch allegiances because he had previously acknowledged Cambodian support, backing, and he had couched himself as like an official of the Cambodians, an Okmian. But in 1708, he found that the Khmer court was too weak to protect him from the Siamese, and so he went and sought the backing of the Vietnamese. So, but Vietnamese suzerainty was not too difficult actually for him to bear, and he was allowed to run Ha Tien fairly autonomously. So he lived, a good long life, and in 1735 he died and left control of Ha Tien, an ethnic Chinese enclave, to his son Mo Tian Ci or Mak Tian Tu. So Mak Tian Tu was a military man, but also and also an able administrator. But he was also a man of letters. On top of running the daily affairs of administration, he enjoyed literary pursuits. So the project I'm talking about today, the 10 Songs of Ha Tien, He Xian Si Yong, was a project that he undertook very soon after he inherited control of Ha Tien from his father. So in this project, Mak Tian Tu wrote 10 initial poems about 10 scenic sites in Ha Tien, and these include a lake, a grotto, a waterfall, but also man-made ones like a temple, and some dwellings. And he sent these poems with a fellow man of letters, a person that he names Master Chen Zikai, who stopped in Ha Tien for a spell in 1736. So this is just 1 year after he took over took over the administration of Ha Tien. And his friend Chen Zikai, on his way back to Guangdong via the coastal route, they copied out Mak Tian Tu's poems and distributed it to poets who lived along the cities, along that route of the South China Sea, to 31 other poets, majority of whom lived actually in Fujian and Guangdong, and then some in Vietnam. And these men then wrote matching poems. They then wrote poems with the same title, and that responded to these landscape poems of Ha Tien, and sent them back when the ship next came down in 1737 to Mak Tian Tu again in Ha Tien. And so Mak Tian Tu then now from his 10, he now has 320 poems, and then he had them carved in wood blocks and printed as a publication dedicated to the beauty of Ha Tien, his realm. So in the preface of this collection, he explains his motivations. He put within a preface, and for someone who works in my time period, when you see a preface, you are delighted. Because you know that it might be a little bit, you have got to read against the grain, but it's someone who is actually expressing his reasons for writing this. And that's a very good starting point. So luckily we have a preface to this literary project. And so this is what he says. This project of writing landscape poetry about Ha Tien is to make known the fact that the scenery, mountains and rivers, have received his father's action of cultural transformation, and then which has greatly increased their strength and beauty. and then the mountains and rivers in receiving again, in turn, the appraisal of these renowned lords, so these poets who are now writing about it, have been further enhanced. And these poems not only contribute to the attractiveness of this, he calls it a sea country, a high war, because Ha Tien is on the coast, right? It's a coastal polity. They, for their part, can act as an official gazetteer of Ha Tien. So I study, with this in mind, I study these poems as Mak Tien Thi's project of civilizing his frontier domain. I use the loaded term civilize here with the sense that the Chinese phrase wenhua brings. Wen brings together two concepts that are integral to the Chinese civilizational discourse. Pattern, the presence of recognizable designs inherent in the warp and woof of nature, and a concept derived from the earlier definition of Wen as pattern, literature or writing, the manifestation of those natural patterns in script. So by saying that Mak Tien Thi civilized his domain, I mean that Mak Tien Thi brought out recognizable patterns in the landscape of Ha Tien through a literary transformation of the scenic sites. So this process brought the landscape of Ha Tien into the realm of having Wen, both in terms of patterns and literature, instead of being a realm of patternless chaos. Moreover, Mak Tien Thi disseminated his poems and solicited responses in the same genre, so that the culturally inscribed landscape now enters into the civilized discourse of intellectuals, and thus it is further enhanced through the 31 other acts of civilization each time a poet writes about it. And so, and each time the poet articulates these patterns in poetry, in this literary circle. So I say a lot about civilizing it and by poetry, but what does it really mean to civilize the landscape through poetry? How do we actually get this? How does the poet actually do something like that? So one way that he does it is to pattern nature. So I'm going to read some poems here that I translated, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my interpretation of these poems. So this is the very first poem of the 10-poem suite. It's a, So this is Golden Islet Blocking Waves. An island of rocky peaks settles the emerald waters, flowing waters by a wondrous beauty yet mighty Ha Tien, obstructing the power waves and billows from the southeast seas. Suns and moons radiance reflect from the sky and down below. Arriving in its waters, fish to dragons accordingly transform. Beside cliffs of trees and stones, they naturally splash a flitter. Sounds of winds and traces of waves, their echoes long endure. A landscape of shadow and light, an unusual kingdom distant. So what this poem is actually describing, right, is Golden Islet. Golden Islet is an island with a mountain on it that is situated right on the coast of Ha Tien. It's sort of like a rocky mount, and by virtue of its position on its coast, it blocks the waves from crashing onto Ha Tien's shores. Right? But what is of interest, and actually when I went to Ha Tien to look for some of these landscapes, this has been reclaimed, so Golden Islet no longer exists, unfortunately. But what we have here in the third couplet, so these two lines form the first couplet, these two the second, the third couplet here, arriving in its waters, fish to dragons transform, beside cliffs of trees and stones they naturally splash a flitter. So this is actually a reference to the myth of Longmen. I think Longmen is quite familiar to some of us, Dragon Gate. And the myth of Dragon Gate is that there are a lot of fish, carp, that try to scale its heights, Yuteng Longmen. They try to jump to actually reach the heights of Longmen, and very few do it. They all try and very few do it. And the myth is that those who actually arrive at the summit will transform into dragons. And so this is an imagery that has been used a lot to actually talk about the imperial examinations. A lot of people try, a lot of scholars try, and very, very few succeed, but those who succeed, they become dragons. So this is actually a myth, right, that has cultural connotations. And in recognizing in Golden Islet, just frankly, a small island with a rocky peak, the pattern of Dragon Gate, the poet Mak Tien Tu gave to Ha Tien. Now remember, Ha Tien is very distant from China. It's not at all in its cultural realm, right? It's even further than a frontier province. But Mak Tien Tu gave to Ha Tien a familiar classical mythological pattern, a classical one. And so the landscape of Ha Tien is no longer chaotic, no longer unknown, no longer patternless, but has in fact taken on a great cultural significance. So this is one way in which he has patterned nature. Another way to pattern nature is to give it order by regulating time. So let's consider one other poem here. Dawn Bell at, well, it's actually Temple of Seclusion. And so I'll just read it again, since I think we do have, yeah. So, remnant stars the residual few towards the heavens are cast. At the fifth watch a bell tolls resounding far from the temple. Purified region and human destiny awaken to the world. A lone sound, clear and distinct, goes out to the river and beyond. Suddenly startled, a crane calls out, soaring on wind above, around the trees. Also urged, a crow cries out from a branch that dangled the moon. At once conscious, 1,000 households push their pillows back. Roosters, chickens spread dawn news, calling out cock-a-doodle-doo. So, clearly this is a poem about the transitional period of dawn. We see from the first couplet here, the second line of the first couplet, right, that time, that nights in Ha Tien are regulated by the night watches. So basically the watches would divide up time in Ha Tien by about 2 hours. There'll be someone going around to beat the drum and the gong, depending on whether it's the half or the full hour. In other words, life in Ha Tien is regulated. It accords to the idea of civilized time. It's not something that is just nebulous and chaotic and goes on and on without design. And at the fifth watch, which marks the dawn, the temple bell tolls. So it is a lone sound because the bell tolls just once at dawn. It's also a lone sound because this temple of seclusion, and by it he also refers metonymically to Ha Tien, is the only temple in the realm, and it stands alone as a marker of civilization in the midst of the uncivilized frontier. And the crane, in the third couplet, after being startled by the bell, flies around the trees, thus circumscribing the realm of the civilized. And the crow, also urged by the sound, cries from a branch that dangled the moon. So the imagery there is that the moon is setting, right? It's so low, it's almost dawn, that it looks as if it's just hanging on the tip of a branch. And that's why it's dangling the moon. And this poem is actually, it's just full of the sounds of dawn, right? Prompted by the toll of the bell, the crane reacts, the crow reacts, and then the roosters all contribute to the sound of morning. And in this poem, nature literally resonates with the sound of the human implement. But this poem actually is also about another awakening, spiritual awakening. The Purified Region, Jing Jing actually, here, Purified Region, refers to the temple, but it also refers to the pure land of Sakavati, a blissful place of rebirth. And the lone sound or the singular sound then can refer to the name of Amitabha. And in the last couplet, we see actually sort of words borrowed from Buddhist terminology that support the interpretation, the layered interpretation, right, of both dawn and spiritual enlightenment, in words such as 顿觉, at once conscious, which is a Buddhist term, and also 传, to transmit. They spread. Oh, it's already bold. Those words are not meant to be. Something happened in the transition, but and it recalls the transmission of teachings that engender spiritual enlightenment. So here we have a poem that is at once about the physical awakening, but also about spiritual awakening. There are actually quite a few more poems that actually very consciously order time and order the seasons and the days and nights, but we won't go through those. But we're going to just one more way in which the poet has tamed or civilized nature. And so this is to bring order to its natural forces. And this is an egret descends from Pearl Cliff. So green foliage and dusty clouds mix with the rosy sunset, flying out from the enchanted cliff on luminous cliff. A white bird emerges aslant, so the imagery has it going downwards. At night, following in heaven's sequence, a thin gauze covers the trees, the fragrant trees. At day, falling off the level cliff, forming splashes of blue flowers. And right at this point, right, the poem is actually discussing a waterfall, but you don't know it yet until the third line, the third couplet. A waterfall and its shadow together tumbling under moonlight on the peak, clouds and lights encircling evenly, dust glows thrown on the sand. Wild sentiments about the course of events, ready to act on plans. In the midst of rushing, I pause on the shore of water and stone, or on this rocky shore. So, as I mentioned, the main feature of this cliff is a waterfall. And you would expect a poem about a waterfall to be loud, like the previous poem, like about the chickens and the birds squawking. But here, you don't hear anything very much. Sound is muted in this poem. The waterfall is, in fact, represented by the mist, the thin gauze covering the trees, referencing the mist. And it's water droplets. So the yu flowers are, jade flowers are small white flowers. So instead of talking about the waterfall, they're just talking about the mist that creates and the water droplets that are splashing. And it's only in the third couplet that the waterfall is mentioned, but at its mention, it is locked in a dance with its own shadow, right? The water and its shadow together tumbling. And so in fact, this mutes again the sound of that waterfall. And the descent of the water is replaced by the smooth flight of the egret as it emerges from the cliff. And in the final couplet, this has an effect on the poet because he's about to rush into something, and then he catches himself. Just as nature is tamed, so is the poet. In the midst of rushing to act upon his plans, he pauses upon the shore of water and stone. So one of the most fascinating discoveries on close reading 10 of these poems. So these poems, I mean, like 2 scholars have looked at 1 or 2 of them, but nobody has actually looked at all 10. And when you look at all 10, there is in fact one more pattern that emerges quite strongly, which I argue helps us to understand this project. So let's look at the first poem. You've already seen this poem, and I referred you to the third couplet, right? So this one, and I referred to this as sort of like the fish transforming to dragons and the myth of Longman. Here, look at this line too. We didn't look at this poem, but just the last line here. Fish dragons, conscious of dreams, rush, but find it hard to break through. Now as always, loyal of heart, just as light reflects above and below. Here, this one, poem number 8. I too know that in the 8 seas, fish dragons hide, radiant moon and glittering waves, at ease I understand. And the very last one, so the very last one and the last poem in the sequence is quite significant as well. And here, you know, the poet concludes not just the last poem, but the entire suite with these words: adrift alone, I laugh at the open sea beyond. I wish to be near to fish dragons, but I still cannot. In 10 poems, the fish dragons occur in 4 of them. And that's not a pattern that we can dismiss. And it stands out as, in fact, the most repeated motif in all of his poetry. And I will admit, when I saw them, I knew they had to mean something, but they just swam around in my head for a long time, and I had no idea what to do with them. And I was trying to decipher the significance of these fish dragons. I had a suspicion. Because of the nature of this project, I suspected that it's a code that actually is referring to the community of Ming Loyalists that lived in the region. But, you know, I surely needed more evidence than just my thoughts and my interpretation. So being a historian, where do I go? I go to the chronicles. So the Vietnamese chronicles actually record that more than 50 years before these poems were composed, in 1679, a faction of Ming Loyalists migrated to the southern Vietnamese frontier. Let me see if I have a map coming up. I do. Okay. So earlier on, I showed how the Mac family the Mak family or the Mo family, they were from here, and then they and their friends came and settled here. But in 1679, there's another group of Ming Loyalists that came and settled on the eastern part of the Mekong Delta. So there are two distinct waves of migration that brought Chinese Ming Loyalists to the Mekong Delta. And this group that settled on the eastern faction, they arrived in 50 ships, and there were about 3,000 of them in all. This faction is not the more famous Taiwan faction led by Zheng Chenggong, by Kwok Sing Na, and so their stronghold was not in Taiwan. Their stronghold is in Longmen, Dragon Gate, which there are several Dragon Gates in China, one of which is here. This little alcove is near Qinzhou. It's actually the entryway to Qinzhou. So the Vietnamese chronicles actually refer to this faction of Ming Loyalists as the Longmen Pai, the Dragon Gate troops, because of where they came from. And it was this strand of Dragon Gate Ming Loyalists that came to be settled in Gia Ding and Bien Hoa. I have a sign for Gia Ding over there. So that's around the contemporary Saigon area, Ho Chi Minh City area. So what actually happened was this group of people came to request asylum from the Southern Vietnamese court. The Southern Vietnamese court, and I'll tell you in a little while about the division between North and South Vietnam. And they requested asylum, but the Vietnamese court was understandably a bit suspicious of having this huge influx of politically inclined Chinese suddenly settling on in the capital. And so the Yuan Lord and his advisors, they conferred about this, and then they decided the best course of action is to settle them in the Mekong Delta because those were Cambodian lands. So the chronicles record that they said, "We have long since wanted to wrest control of this area from the Cambodians. So let's just settle the Chinese there where they can cultivate the land and be loyal to us." So in this way, they settled the people there in two groups, Ninh Tho and Bien Hoa, which are the names of the two areas today as well. And again, right, the Mak family of Ha Tien is not from this group that came, but during this period of time, because of the shipping routes, this and this area would have been neighbors. So by land, it's going to take quite a while to get there, but by ship, this is the very next port of call. And so the busy port of Gia Ding, established by the Longmen Pai, by the Dragon Gate faction, can be considered Ha Tien's closest neighbor. And it's therefore not surprising that Mak Tien Thi's poetry was filled with references to Longmen, to Dragon Gate, and the myth of fish dragons. And so through the 10 Songs of Ha Tien project, his landscape poetry project, Mak Tien Thi was able to communicate with and bring together a specific Chinese diaspora group, a group of Ming Loyalists, and express his thoughts to them. His opening poem, actually I have it here, his opening poem, in which he describes fish splashing a flitter by the rocks in order to reach the waters where they would transform into dragons, positioned Ha Tien as the new Dragon Gate, the new Longmen, the new stronghold for the Ming Loyalists that remain. And in the final couplet of his 10th poem, the final words to his fellow poets, right? He identified them as, let's see, I have it here. He identified them as scattered in the open sea, and he felt keenly his physical distance from them, and he could only gaze upon the waters where he knew they resided, while wishing to be nearer to them. So with this in mind, I went back to the poems again to see if I could discover anything else. Oops, sorry. Okay. So let's have a look here. This fourth line, right? 日月光为上下天. It's visually significant because of the first two characters, 日 and 月. Put them together, they spell Ming. And they make the character Ming. And so retranslated, the line can read, the radiance of the Ming reflects from the sky and down below. And moreover, a student of mine who speaks Cantonese, which is the language that they would be speaking, and I don't, I speak a Fujian dialect, pointed out to me that the last two characters, Xia Tian, is in Cantonese is Ha Tian, which is a homonym for Ha Tian, right, He Xian. And so this line could even read, the radiance of the Ming reflects upon Ha Tian. And then another character here in the last line, Yi Guo Xue, the third from the last character. Here I translated it as unusual, but it actually means like heterodox. And it has been reused to refer to the Qing dynasty, which was Manchu and not Han. And so this line could really read a landscape of shadow and light, distant from the heterodox kingdom. And then you see, right, all these other things, sounds of winds and traces of waves. What does that mean, right? I mean, that's basically the people who still remain loyal. Yeah. So in other words, Mak Tien Te invited his fellow Ming loyalists to come to Ha Tien, to make Ha Tien their home, which would be distant from that heterodox Qing kingdom. So there are some other things in the other poems, but I'll leave that for now. And go back to the question with which we began. So what then does Ming loyalism mean a century after the fall of the Ming dynasty? So Mak Tien Te's poems show a concern not for re-establishing the Ming dynasty, it's far too late for that, this is a whole century after, but with expressing a cultural identity in common with others of similar political persuasion. Through his literary project, he sought the company of others in a similar position to him, second or third generation Ming loyalists. He composed these landscape poems and compiled responses from 31 other poets, and 15 of them live in Fujian, 13 live in Guangdong, and the rest were scattered around various parts of Vietnam. And all of these would be very linked to the seafaring community. These poets need not have ever stepped foot in Ha Tien, but their poems, composed to match Mak Tien Te's, contributed to the Feng Ya, the heirs and oaths of Ha Tien, and they therefore participated in the process of civilizing Ha Tien. So that is Mak Tien Te's project. But things change in politics. And about 20 to 30 years after this poet Mak Tien Te composed the poems, he invited one other person to contribute matching poems. So I alluded earlier to like a South and a North Vietnam. I'll go into that a little bit right now. So during this time, Vietnam was actually divided into two polities along the Giang River. This is the river that divided into North and South. Incidentally, it's actually very close to the 17th parallel, which divided North and South Vietnam in the 20th century. And the northern Vietnamese polity had its capital here in Hanoi, and the southern one in Hue, but Saigon was really coming up and coming. And so basically they were led by two rival families. They were essentially governed separately, even though nominally they both respected the Lê kings. And so Vietnamese history would still put this as sort of like one period under the Lê dynasty, but really some people would even talk about it as the Jin and the Nguyen period because it was really divided into two. And so the Chinese that came to settle, they had come to the southern Vietnamese court to seek refuge, and partly because the north was just too close to Qing China. So the control, they would be much more reticent to take them in. The south was a little bit further and more willing to entertain some of these more these people that that the Qing government would frown upon. Okay, so in the 18th century, the southern Vietnamese kingdom, they were sort of like separating from the north from the 16th century onwards. But in the 18th century, they were actually migrating into the delta very aggressively, actually putting people there, getting territories, a lot with the help of the Chinese population, in fact, that they settled there. And so the person that Mak Tien Te invited to contribute response poetry is called Yuan. In Chinese is Guan Juzhen, and he is a very, very important South Vietnamese official. He was from a family that was part of the first group that came down south. At the height of his career, he was in charge, basically, of ensuring the proper annexation of the entire delta for the Nguyen family. And so around 20 to 30 years later, in the winter of 1750, basically, Yuan was appointed to be the supervisor of the newly annexed provinces in the Mekong Delta. And of course, this comes to include Mak Tin Tu's autonomous Chinese enclave. So you see here an overlapping of two realms, right? One, an autonomous Chinese enclave that is increasingly under Vietnamese control. Yuan had a very long tenure, in fact, on the Mekong Delta, and he was there for 11 years, from 1754 to 1765. And sometime during this period of time, he contributed the 10 poems in response to Mak Tin Tu's poems. We don't know exactly when, because he didn't date them, but the fact that we have two complete sets of frontier poems that are in conversation with each other is extremely fortuitous. They lived in a very politically turbulent time, and the preservation of their literary works is not something to be taken for granted. So I will now present a few of Yuan Qiuqian's poems, looking at the time maybe, it is important to recognize that Yuan Qiuqian's responses were not only reactions to Mak Tin Tu, but that he had his own project. And so I choose poems that exemplify his political vision. So, of course, I'm going to show you the very first poem, 正 here, that I translated as secure. This is instructive. It means to protect, but it also has connotations of settling and fixing something down. In fact, the golden islet here, sort of like an island with a rocky peak on it, is reminiscent of Mount Luofu, a mountain familiar to landscape poetry of Guangdong. Mount Luofu sits in the seas in front of Guangdong, settles the stormy seas, and holds Guangdong in its place, holds the province in its place, so that it does not float away in the South Sea. And here in Hatien, Golden Islet performs the same function, right, as Mount Luofu. It settles the waters, and it does it so well that it has affected the behaviors of the creatures of the sky and of the sea. So the Jingwei bird is believed to be the reincarnation of Nuwa. Nuwa drowned in the Eastern Sea and blamed it for her death and reincarnated as a Jingwei bird. This is from the Shanhai Jing. She tries to kill the sea by filling it up with stones. Of course, right, the Jingwei bird is never able to succeed, and so she symbolizes despair. Right? But here the sea is so well behaved that even the Jingwei bird's anger is partially dispelled. And then the locus classicus of the Li dragon, the black dragon, is the Zhuangzi. It refers to an ever vigilant dragon who lives in the water and guards a pearl attentively. So the waters of Hatien are so calm that even the Li dragon nods off while it is performing its duties of guarding. So in regulated verse, these poems are all in regulated verse, we divide the poem into 3 or 4 parts. So I've been referring to couplets, right? So the first 2 couplets here, these 2, they introduce the topic. So all of these, there's a very standard, the couplets play standard roles. The first 2 would introduce the topic, right? So here we have the topic of the mountain peak in front of the riverfront. The second 2 couplets, so this one and this one, they elaborate upon the theme that is proposed in the first one. So here, they describe the waves and they emphasize a little bit more of the majesty of the rock. Sometimes, we'll see one poem, the third couplet can perform the function of a twist, of a turn. So, but that's optional in terms of the rules of the poetry. And then the last couplet is very important because that is the place in which it concludes, but it's also the place in which you find the I comment. So very often in Chinese poetry, you won't get the poet saying me or I. The subject is not present. But when you're reading regulated verse, for the last couplet, the translator or the reader can quite confidently include an I in the translations. Here, however, you'll see that the I becomes a you comment, right? Because this is responding to Mak Tin Tu. So it is the place where you'll find Yuan Qiuqian, the second poet, responding directly to Mak Tin Tu. So in the final couplet here, Yuan Qiuqian refers to Mak Tin Tu as the gentleman, as the sky-bearing pillar, the gentleman who holds up the sky. And this is a reference to the idea that the sky is held up by 8 pillars. And just as Golden Islet fixes Hatien in its place, its geopolitical place, Mak Tin Tu plays a similar role and holds up this Hatien sky. So they both, Golden Islet and Hatien, act as anchors of Hatien's natural and cosmic universe, natural world and cosmic universe. So the next poem, Stone Grotto Souls Clouds. I'll read it. So one mountain breaks open to form two large grottos. So imagine it's a mountain with like very large caves with openings, right? So it's mountain with very large caves with several openings. I've actually been to it. It's quite fun. It swallows down floating clouds and lets none slip away. Curled looper and extended dragon are enveloped and swallowed. A soaring simurgh and flying phoenix are encompassed and entrapped. In a bottle gourd, fire is wet and mist is frozen and heavy. In a stone chamber, man is cold and its purple hues are deep and intense. So the idea being that in the cave, right, it's a humid, miasmic environment actually. And then emerging from the peak, about to demonstrate its capacity for brilliant colors, the mighty sun brings order to mountains and rivers. Okay, it's a bit enigmatic. So let's just go through this. Right? So we've established that the opening line talks about one mountain with a very large cave with several openings, some yawning gaps in the mountain. And clouds float in and out and makes it appear as if the cave is swallowing the clouds. Right? That's why it's tun. Right? And then the curled looper, extended dragon, soaring simurgh, and flying phoenixes, they're all references to the clouds in their various shapes. And actually at the same time, the two phrases also refer to fine penmanship and flourishes in writing. So it's a nod towards the previous person's literary talent, the previous poet's literary talent. So the third couplet is actually where I had to pause. Remember I said that the third couplet can enact a twist or a turn? So here's an example of that. The bottle gourd and the stone chamber alludes to actually the myth of Panhu. So the story goes that there was an old woman in the palace of Emperor Ku, Gao Xin Shi, during the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors period. And this old woman had a headache, and she cured herself by extracting a worm from her ear. So what do you do with a worm like this? She kept the worm actually in a hollowed out gourd, and she covered the gourd with a platter. And then inside the gourd, this worm actually transforms into a brilliant colored dog. And so because of its origins, the dog's name is Panhu, literally platter gourd. So during this time, Emperor Ku was attacked by the Qianrong, non-ethnic Han, and a northwestern tribe who had in their army a general that he couldn't defeat. So of course, what does he do? He declares, whoever can defeat this general and bring me his head, I will marry my daughter to you. And of course, no man succeeds, but Panhu, the dog, does. And so he wins his prize, he carries the princess off to a stone chamber. That's why the stone chamber in a mountain, in the southern mountain. And they had 6 sons and 6 daughters who became the ancestors of the Man people in the south. So, and I mean, we want to actually recognize that these terms are, like I translated as Man people, but it would be okay to also translate it as Man barbarians because they're referring to people who are non-ethnic Han, and civilizationally they wouldn't think of them as being equal on the civilizational hierarchy. So the story of Panhu is set in the southern extremities of the Middle Kingdom, far from the capital. And the offsprings are the barbarians, who are also considered the enemies of the Hua people. So the choice of allusion here is very curious. Nguyen Hu Jin, the poet, in his other poems had actually taken pains to portray Hatien as a civilized place. But here, the bottle gourd and the stone chamber are miasmic environments. The association with the Mun tribes is a further indication of the unruly nature of southern lands. So it's puzzling that he would use this poem in a project that acts in a civilizing manner. But I think the answer to this puzzle lies in the last couplet. The last couplet refers to the sun, right? Emerging from the peak, about to demonstrate its brilliant colors. What is emerging from the peak is the sun. In which, when it rises from behind the peak, it casts its brilliant colors over the lands of Hatien and brings order to its mountains and rivers. Now compare this last couplet to the last couplet of the poem to which he was responding, Mak Thiên Tu's poem. I won't go through the whole poem, so let's just look at the last line. Right? At the utmost, the quintessence, heights where few men reach, I breathe according to the wind from the lofty peak. In his poem, Mak Thiên Tu had positioned himself at the top of the mountain peak. So what Nguyen Thu Trinh is doing in his poem is essentially comparing Mak Thiên Tu to the sun, which brings order and civilization to Ha Tien. So it seems that Nguyen Thu Trinh is really exalting Mak Thiên Tu. After all, he compares him to the sun, to a sky-bearing pillar. What could be more exalted? But when we look closely, we see that he is also constraining and confining Mak Thiên Tu's political role that he plays. Nguyen Thu Trinh is using praise and persuasion, but also coercion. He's turning Mak Thiên Tu into a vehicle, an instrument of the court, of the Vietnamese court, where he's fulfilling his civilizing mission. In Nguyen Thu Trinh's poems, Mak Thiên Tu becomes the means. Whereas Mak Thiên Tu sees his project as an end in itself, a civilizing project, Nguyen Thu Trinh teaches Mak Thiên Tu his place as a means to fulfilling the civilizing mission of the Vietnamese court that Nguyen Thu Trinh represents. So this is a good time to ask the question. Oops. Here. What happened to the fish dragons? I mean, the fish dragons were so weighty in the previous poem that it is actually extremely surprising that you don't see a response to them. And so Nguyen Thu Trinh, in fact, all but ignored the motif, except to address it very inconspicuously in one poem. So this is the egret. This is the poem about the waterfall, right, where the egret is descending from Pearl Cliff. And I won't read through this one, but it's his response to it. And the small splashes of water from the first poem, the little jade flowers, they're mirrored here in the form of little frost flakes. Here, little frost flakes, the tiny flowers. The mountain, soaked with water from the waterfall, that he compares to flawless jade, in fact brings to mind Dragon Gate, Long Mun, the one where the fish are trying to scale the waterfall to transform into dragons. However, at this mountain, the fish, Yu Shi have neglected their plans. What are these plans? The plans to transform into dragons. And to make sure that the reader really gets the message, the next line emphasizes that the swans have forgotten their way home. This is in fact the only place where Nguyen Thu Trinh responds directly to the motif of the fish dragons. And notice that it's also, somewhat buried, right? The second couplet, not the fourth or the first, which are more significant. Yeah. In Mak Thiên Tu's final couplet, he, the poet, had tamed. He was tamed. Remember, he said, I'm about to rush with plans, but I pause. I'm consolidating. And here, looking at Nguyen Thu Trinh last couplet, he says to Mak Thiên Tu, you had wanted to be a guest in the halls of Black Road Lane, Wu Yi Xiang. In the end, in the midst of bustling, you chuckle from the end of the earth. So here in Nguyen Thu Trinh final couplet, he compares Mak Thiên Tu's Ming Loyalist plans, upon which the latter had been ready to act, to a desire to be a guest at Black Road Lane. So this Black Road Lane is actually a reference to 5 poems written by the Tang poet Liu Yuxi, specifically to the second of his 5 poems about Nanjing. And Black Road Lane is where all of the elite of Nanjing used to live, but then it's since experienced decline, so that the only guests that the halls now have are the swallows that fly into empty halls. So comparing Mak Thiên Tu's Ming Loyalist plans to a desire to be a guest in Black Road Lane is to imply that his dreams belong to a previous era. In his poem, Nguyen Thu Trinh had paused on the shore, and here, in the poem, Mak Thiên Tu had paused on the shore, and here Nguyen Thu Trinh extended his pause to an eternity, where the poet, where Mak Thiên Tu now chuckles to himself about his obsolete plans. So as the landscape poetry attests, Nguyen Thu Trinh vision for Ha Tien was at loggerheads with Mak Thiên Tu's ambitions in multiple respects. The two men represented 2 different political realms on the Mekong Delta, and their poems reflect the difference. Written 2 to 3 decades after the 10 Song of Ha Tien's project was completed, Nguyen Thu Trinh response to Mak Thiên Tu constituted a re-inscription of Ha Tien's landscape at a time when Ha Tien was becoming increasingly drawn deeper and deeper into the Vietnamese political realm. Perhaps because Nguyen Thu Trinh, as Gan Chong's representative, as the Southern Vietnamese representative, was considered the more important political actor Vietnamese. Lake Vidon, who is we rely a lot on Lake Vidon's works now to learn about Vietnam. He recorded in 1770s all of Yuan Yuchin's 10 poems in their entirety, while he only copied 2 of Mak Thiên Teu's poems. And the wood blocks from Mak Thiên Teu's 10 Songs of Hatien project have not survived. Only a poor hand-copied version exists as a withered testament to Mak Thiên Teu's ambitious political vision. Conversely, the Frontier Chronicles, Lake Vidon's Frontier Chronicles, where Yuan Yuchin's poems are captured, survive in excellent condition. So Yuan Yuchin's literary reinscription of Hatien remain etched much more deeply in historical record than Mak Thiên Teu's original inscriptions, a fact that mirrors the fates of their competing civilizing projects. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Claudine. Would open it up for some questions and answers now? Anybody would like to start?
Yes, sir. I have a silly question. Are those Ming lawyer refugees, when they settle in Vietnam or the Delta, do they still keep their own language, or they are communicating with the locals in different languages? I mean, this Yuan person, basically he's responding in traditional Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually shocked me. Do they speak Chinese at that point of time,
Okay,
or they have their different languages?
that is not at all a silly question. So in a way, how would they were communicating? I think Cantonese would have been used quite a lot. But the question then is, why is it that the Vietnamese official is also writing in this,
Yeah.
right? So that, to answer that, we have to go a little bit into sort of like the Vietnamese classical literary tradition. So basically, Vietnamese records are captured in 2 different scripts. Well, now we have the Romanized script, but previously their historical, literary, and religious record are in 2 scripts. One is classical Chinese. So all the educated Vietnamese would have been educated in classical Chinese, in Wenyan, in literary Chinese. So their history is, the official histories are all captured in literary Chinese. A lot of the literary production, the poetry is also like this. But there is another world of the vernacular, right? They will call it 字南, 南字, basically, but then they flip it because of the Vietnamese grammar. So that's chữ nôm, and that one would be used for a lot of the religious material is captured in that script, and more vernacular literature would be in that. So an educated Vietnamese would be able to communicate in both of these. I imagine, like in the court, they might speak in the Vietnamese language, but they would all have to demonstrate an ability to write in classical Chinese. And this poetic form it follows exactly the classical Chinese regulated verse, the 经体字, right? I mean, 经体诗, yeah. So the rules and everything, they would have been educated in that as well. Sometimes it's a little bit, when I'm reading it, sometimes it comes off a bit stilted, maybe not as natural, but still very much a part of that tradition. When they communicate with each other, I've seen letters where, like Yuan Yuchin and Mak Thiên Teu, they wrote letters to each other as well. And we don't have any of Mak Thiên Teu's letters left, but we have a couple from Yuan Yuchin, the Vietnamese official. And it's also in classical Chinese, but sometimes just a little weird. Like, a little bit of a local inflection that is in there, too many zhs for regular, but that's because in Vietnamese they use z quite a lot, and that's how it would be read. So a poem like this, an educated Vietnamese would read Sino-Vietnamese as, I'm sure they could pronounce it in, they would call it they call this Han characters, and they would pronounce it in Sino-Vietnamese. So sometimes the rhyme doesn't work as perfectly, but they would all be memorizing actually the poetic rhyme tables, which any student at that time would have to memorize. I never memorized it because I can just go online to find it now, to know how it rhymes. But sometimes I look at it and I'm like, oh, it doesn't rhyme, but when I check the rhyme tables, it totally rhymes, according to that. So I think that's why you have this in the sort of classical Chinese form. But they also wrote poetry in the vernacular form. And that follows a completely different poetic structure. That's the Lubat system, Lubat structure, where it's like 6/8 and the rhyming works a bit differently. Yeah. So they have poems also, they have literature also in the vernacular, and here we're only looking at the classical one. But I've also studied some of the vernacular poems. Yeah.
Mark?
Thanks very much. In the same spirit as the previous question, at the risk of sounding ignorant in this regard, I'm just curious. I mean, is this a very distinct phenomenon in the Chinese diaspora at this period? That we really have these, as I understand it, two diaspora communities in southern Vietnam, or the area that we call Vietnam today, or are there other communities elsewhere in the region? And I mean, it's very interesting because you have these, as you're describing, as sort of political, cultural communities, which is very different than the kind of picture you get when you look at sort of Chinese diaspora communities, say in places like the Philippines or in Thailand and so on, where the focus is much more on the commercial aspects and so on. And which raises the question also, is this cultural flowering quite distinct in this? Or do you find communities that don't have this strong political motivation also with these kind of periods of it seems like incredible cultural achievement? And the final point is, how long does this last? I mean, how long, given the fact that after 100 years, of course, it becomes evident that the Ming are definitely going to be restored, Qing are there to stay, how long does this distinctive political, cultural community remain, and then to what extent does it just melt away? And I can't resist thinking of modern day examples of political exile communities. Think of the Cubans who moved to Florida and retained the hope of restoring the previous kingdom, as it were. But when there's a sufficient number of people to maintain cultural traditions and also political aims. Train of thought here. And also, why the effort to sort of disguise the messages? Why not come out and say it more openly?
Okay. The last, because during this time, if those messages had been detected, it would have caused problem for the people who lived in the southern provinces of China. So the Vietnamese community, the Chinese community in Vietnam, it's not a big deal. But there were a lot of the interlocutors were residing in southern China. And the Qing government, sometimes they were more lax, but in this period of time, the middle century, was actually a little bit more nervous about some of these expressions. Not because they were afraid the Ming Dynasty was coming back, but they saw this as sort of like political opposition that they would be very cautious about. So that's why, I think one is that, and two, just because it's fun. It's fun to sort of disguise it and like sending out these things, and the responses also have some of these coming back. So I think part of it is sort of just, it's part of the leisure, but it's also part of the political demands. And of course, the questions you ask are extremely important, difficult to answer, and not at all simple. So about the political cultural communities, actually, I didn't answer one part of your question, which I think I know now. How were they communicating, right? We actually, in Vietnam, what I'm showing now is the Ming Loyalist migration. And later on, you'll have another wave of migration coming in from the Qing. And you have actually then, in Vietnam today, when you want to refer to the Chinese community, you have a general term, Nguyen Hoa, which is like Hoa people, but you will also have the Ming Xiang people, so referring to the people who came or who have like connections to the Ming, therefore much earlier migrants. And then the other ones are the Qingren, the Tangyan, so people who came during the time of the Qing. And which answer am I giving right now? So this would be the one about how long did it last, right? I have, it's too bad I deleted those slides, but because it was too long. But I actually have a collection of, we have time, right? I can tell some stories. So when I first started this project, I was actually looking for something else, and I was looking for a vernacular Vietnamese text. I knew that there was a woodblock print in Paris, and so I went to Paris to look for it, and the Longzhou. And they had it, and they let me look at it, but they wouldn't let me take pictures of it. So I had to basically sit there to hand copy it out, which is a terrible idea because I don't know how to read the script. It's a Chinese form of the script. I don't know how to read it, and I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. But what am I going to do? So I'm sitting there, and then suddenly this librarian comes up, and she's like tapping me, and she's like, "You can read this?" And I'm like, "Well, no, but I'm going to learn." And then she said, "Okay, you come back tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Look for me." So I'm like, "Okay." And so she takes my book away, my precious book. And then at 2 o'clock the next day I come, and she's like, she set up in her office the book plus like, you know, the nice heavy weights to weigh it down. And she's like, "Take pictures, take whatever you want. I just sign it, I'm not going to sell it." And then she has a whole stack, and she said, "And you know, when you're done with this, come back because nobody has read any of these." And so, of course, I took pictures of them. Well, actually, I didn't at the point because I was so overwhelmed. And 10 years later, I went and I took pictures of all the other books that she had wanted me to read. And the interesting thing is that all of those books, they're in vernacular Vietnamese, and so they're distributed in Saigon, but they're printed actually in Guangdong. And the person, it's edited by a person. So some of these, a lot of them are scholar beauty romances. Some of them are. I know for sure some of them have Vietnamese origin, but a lot of them are sort of like Chinese stories that are rendered now in Vietnamese vernacular. And the person, one main person, actually two, but one very predominant one, actually did a lot of the editing of these, and I imagine he was a driving force. I don't really know much about him, but he was a driving force in getting these woodblock prints done. And he goes by a pen name, Wei Ming Shi, uniquely Ming, a man of the Ming. A man of like only the Ming, uniquely Ming. So again, right, this sort of a gesturing towards the Ming dynasty, but this is in 1874, like really late. So again, I don't think they're trying to set up a Ming dynasty. And how do we understand this sort of like a continued use of the label, right? I wouldn't say allegiance anymore, but sort of use of the label. I understand it as a reaction against the Qing community, because the Ming community, the Ming dynasty migrants, the Ming loyalists would be able to read Vietnamese by now. They're actually very well assimilated, might be a word to use, assimilated into the Vietnamese community in a way that the later migrants are not. So for example, when I go to Vietnam, I speak Vietnamese, but when I go to Chợ where the Chinese community is, they speak Cantonese, and I can't get around there. It's hilarious actually, because when I first went, they were like, "Oh, you're Chinese, go to the Chinese area and like have fun." So I went to the Chinese area and I couldn't do anything. They were speaking to me in Cantonese. I was like, "No, I had no idea." And then I tried Vietnamese with them, and they're like, "We have no idea what you're talking about," because they never learned Vietnamese. So basically, we have in the Chinese community a real divide. And I think the use of the Ming loyalist label speaks to that domestic Chinese politics in Vietnam that distinguishes them from the later migrants. And the earlier Ming loyalists, the descendants, they're also much more educated. They participate much more in politics and the cultural life of Vietnam. So as for how long this continues, I think it morphs, but it changes. And right now, today, if you go to some of the temples, you'll still see that they'll note that this is a Mingxiang temple. So the appellation is still used today, but the Ming community really is quite integrated, and it's in fact the Cantonese-speaking one that isn't as integrated today. And then the other question about the political cultural communities, right, and the cultural production versus the typical way we talk about them in terms of economics. One of the things that I look at is also Chinese migrations to Southeast Asia. I teach that as one of the courses at the university, and we actually see sort of like an interesting divide in a lot of places where there was more political proscription against the Chinese. You see them involving themselves much more in economics. So in Thailand and Indonesia, for example, they're much more in a way, they take on Thai names or Indonesian names, they participate much more economically. And I think in Vietnam, we actually have a situation where because culturally, it's much more, the barriers to entry into Vietnamese society is much lower, right? I mean, they can enter into like educated society quite easily with the literary Chinese. And so that also opens a space for participation in cultural life that might not be present in where, let's use the word host societies, right? In host societies where there might be much higher barrier to entry, even in terms of religion, right? It's not a very high barrier to entry at all. And in fact, where we would actually see a bit more similarity is with Korea. I don't know very much, and I don't know anything about Korean history, but I've been talking to some people who work in Korean studies who were suggesting that we should actually get together because they see much more similarity between Vietnam and Korea and the way that the Chinese Ming Loyalists participated. Yeah, and thought it would be productive for comparison and collaboration. Yeah.
Of course, Claudine. It could be because you talked about Amitabha and the Pure Land, one of the poems. It could also be because I'm a scholar of Buddhism, but throughout these poems I started to see at least resonance with Buddhist sutras, or at least there's some of the Buddhist poetry, there's, talks about, it's like blah, 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 and then awakenness or consciousness, and I can't read Chinese or speak Chinese, but I'm wondering, like, poem 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10 read very much like, even here, you chuckle from the end of the earth, seems like very Buddhist inspired, and then if I really wanted to make a connection, 10 poems with the 10 Oxford or wood blocks, that's really going over too much, but is that an element that's found throughout?
I actually thought about that quite a bit. Buddhist and Taoist terminology shows up quite a lot. About the 10, I think there's I've seen a lot of landscape poems that are like in 10 and 12.
Okay.
So I think that might be from a different tradition. But let's go to one of them. Which one is that one that I wanted to? The one with the jade flowers, because that's also like elixirs, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's much more Taoist. So actually, I see a lot of there's of course the Buddhist, and then a lot of the Taoist terminology. They even have the Bi Luo is another term that shows up that I had. It's not here, but I talked about like the encompassing sky. So one of the things that I actually had to think about was how are actually these poems being used? How are these terms being used in the poems? And then I had to read up quite a bit about this. Does it actually indicate a sort of like a strength of belief in this, or is it just are they there to sort of cast an aura, right? To just sort of indicate a like, wow, this place is sort of spiritual. Yeah, and I'm tempted to go towards the latter, specifically in this one actually, the Clear Waves on South Bay. You'll see Bi Luo showing. No, not this one. Actually, it's not this one. But anyway, the moon's reflection on these lakes. That one has people. So I had to read up a little bit with I think Stephen Bokenkamp has one on the Bi Luo question that's in Taoist studies, and then I think was it Stephen Owen who has another article on Buddhist terminology, and the question that they all ask is, to what extent do we read this imagery? And actually that's a question that permeates throughout. To what extent do I read the black dragon or the Jingwei, or sometimes they even refer to Cao Cao and all. In fact, Cao Cao, he's like not a great figure in Chinese history, but when they talked about it in one of the poems, it's like, look at the strength of his military maneuvers. It's really quite celebratory. So it's how I read. It's a constant question, in other words, when interpreting the poetry. What level do you read the imagery? And I think part of it is my sort of like an educated guess, a translation decision that is tied very much to interpretation. Another one actually is to look at most of them, and a lot of the poetry, a lot of landscape poetry actually dabbles. They dabble with, and Bokenkamp actually has come up with this criteria that he uses. Okay, so Bi Luo is invoked. Does it come with, he has three rules that he follows. Does it then come with other terms that refer to, I forget now exactly what, that would gesture towards a deeper meaning, and then if that does it go to another one? And for him, only if it fulfills all three of those, are they really engaging with the imagery as a religious imagery. And then otherwise, he would just confine it to, say, sort of like embellishments or decoration. And I read in none of the poems does it actually go in that kind of depth. And so I've read them very much as like, as decoration. It shows up everywhere, purple auras,
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Claudine. Love it. Just wondering whether there are also paintings or wall scrolls available that would visualize the landscape through illustrations. And also, I wonder, because you also mentioned that Lower Mekong, it was also there are also a lot of people, let's say Khmer, because it was a Khmer border, and Japanese also started to leave a presence there. I wonder what their reaction is to this kind of Ming Loyalist idea, and I also wonder because Japanese also read classical Chinese, and whether that would also have an impact. Like when you said that there's some similarities between Korean case and Vietnamese case, I wonder if there's also like a comparison between Japanese case.
So in terms of paintings, we don't have any. I mean, we don't even have the original of these poems. We just have what the FAO copied when they came, and so that's what like a microfilm, a hazy microfilm version is actually what we have left. And and I think that's a very logical question to ask, right? Like, because a lot of landscape poetry is so evocative of image that they are in fact very often there with painting. But I also imagine in terms of a project like this, which requires the mass production in an age that is not mass production, the painting would have been difficult, right? Because this was actually done to disseminate. You write the 10, you disseminate, and then you collect back. And the painting would have been much harder to then disseminate. And I don't, as far as I know, I don't think painting enters in sort of this kind of like a dialogic discourse, as far as I know. Because in poetry, that's a very standard, like a poetic form where you write, the other person responds, and then you respond again, and then they respond. Usually they're face to face. They're not usually far away from each other. But maybe that's why it's not accompanied by image. And as for the Khmer and Japanese, so they have references to the Khmer people being there. But this project is actually, I think, directed very much in the direction of the Chinese community. Especially, we're talking about the original ones, right? Not the Vietnamese responses, but the original Chinese ones. And one of the poems that I didn't put up here, poem number 4, actually even hints at it, because there's only one poem where they're talking about like the strength of their defenses. And of course, these defenses are not coastal, but on the border with Cambodia. So they're talking about a defensive, like a station there, a fortress wall, and they don't have to say it, but its location, it's defending against the, So having said that, the issue actually is that Mak Thiên Tu actually has very close ties with the Khmer people. During that period of time when there was a lot, like the Cambodian politics at this time was a little bit tumultuous. There was some, someone killed the king, the brother-in-law is like taking over. It's quite messy. And they're pissing off the Vietnamese. They're angering the Vietnamese because they refuse to pay tribute because they're like, this land is ours, So, but they're sort of like vassal to the Vietnamese. So whenever they run into trouble, they will go to Ha Tien, to Mak Thiên Tu, and say, please intercede for us. So Mak Thiên Tu actually acts as an intermediary between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. And then he will come up with a plan. Like, okay, fine, if you cede these 2 provinces, maybe then the king will forgive you. And they'll be like, okay, fine, we'll cede these 2 provinces. And then he will bring the petition to the Vietnamese court. So Mak Thiên Tu actually plays sort of like this project shows one face of him, but he really has many faces, including one letter that I've seen where he represented himself as the Cambodian king to the Japanese. So we don't know whether someone translated for him, but that letter is actually in Khmer. It's in the Khmer script. it's very well that someone could have written it for him, but it could also be that he's conversant in Khmer, and he's asking the Japanese to please continue the junk trade because they had stopped it for a while because of the political turmoil, and he's like, no, we really want to, and he signs off himself as the Khmer king. So, he also has that kind of a connection over there. I actually don't know much about the Ming Loyalist community in Japan and what they were doing, so maybe that's another part that to expand after talking to the people in Korean studies, maybe Japanese studies next.
Sounds like fascinating.
Expansive.
Any last questions? We have a couple minutes left. Oh, yes, Professor.
I'm from the Department of Chinese and History. I find your talk very interesting because I studied the history of Guangdong. So my first question is, was this diaspora people, have any, still have any connection with the people back in Xinjiang, the Roman Xinjiang, given that it is maybe a business connection? The second question is, because the Guangdong and Guangxi literary people always perceive that, as part of their own history, right, because of the Southern Yue Kingdom. So is this idea also expressed in these poems?
So I'm beginning to wish I had just put all the poems out and then selectively. There's one poem, in fact, by the Vietnamese official, that when he's talking to Martin Du, right, he refers to him as Guangzhou Ren. He actually refers to him as a man of Guangzhou, even though he's from Beizhou.
He used the term Guangzhou.
He used Guangzhou Ren.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So he actually uses the term Guangzhou in poetry. That's as far as I have seen. And at that point, so Martin Du would have been born in Vietnam. His mother is actually Vietnamese. Yeah, but in writing to him, he still refers to him as Guangzhou. Yeah, which is yeah. And he's saying because the first poem he had written that the scenery in Ha Tien is strange, but then his response poem was like, this place is so wonderful, it should really be familiar to a Guangzhou.
So then how about the idea of Yue or that? Yeah.
I don't see that actually. I mean, I haven't come across that about if anything, I've seen more of because that suggestion is as if Guangzhou is separate from Viet, right?
Or the other way around.
No, I mean it's from the Vietnamese side. From the Vietnamese side.
From the Vietnamese side.
Yes. So from the Vietnamese side, what I'm seeing is that if he's referring to him as Guangzhou Ren, it might indicate a separation that might be different from the Guangzhou poetry, or Guangdong poetry that might consider all the Yue as part of So I wouldn't be surprised if I see that separation a little more in the Vietnamese poetry. But unfortunately, we just don't have a lot that we can then use to corroborate what we see in one. Although I do plan to translate a few more things, but they're all by the same author, all by Ren Yujin. Yeah, and I don't actually have any more by other people. Yeah, and then you were also asking about the business connections. I think in 1874, the 1870s period, what you see with the vernacular texts that are going up to Guangdong and coming down and all that, in Foshan specifically, that's definitely business connection, right? So it would have been business connection all the way till the late 19th century. Currently, I bet there is, but I haven't studied that as much. But I think the interesting thing is that the Saigon community got their woodblocks done in Foshan, although Hanoi had its own woodblock printing industry. So it's not as if woodblock printing was absent in Vietnam. So all the books that were distributed in the Hanoi area, all were printed in Hanoi. They look different. The books actually, the size is a bit different. The quality of the paper is not as good. Foshan paper is actually thicker. The ink doesn't bleed through to the next side. And so for the books that were from the Zhelan area, the Saigon area, they were all from Foshan. Yeah. And the books even, actually they have a stamp that says 姑苏原本, as if the origin was from Suzhou. But I think that's just advertisement because the quality is supposed to be good. So there's no, I think it's just a stamp there from Suzhou, but actually it's not.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're all out of time. So we just want to give one more round of applause to Dr. Young.
Thanks so much. very kind.
Yes, thank you for coming.